Hello, I'm Amy Tomchin, the Senior Development Executive for the Mid-Atlantic region of American Friends of the Hebrew University. For 95 years, AFHU has matched the passion of Americans with the expertise of Israel. With 6 offices around the country, last year, the organization raised over $67 million in support of faculty recruitment, research, and scholarships so that students could get the best, most well-rounded education available in Israel. The Hebrew University is a highly interdisciplinary institution and values collaboration. In that spirit, we've collaborated locally with the Jewish Genealogy Society of Greater Washington to develop this program. And now please welcome Sheila Wexler, the Society's president, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Amy. The Jewish Genealogy Society of Greater Washington is honored to have this opportunity to partner with American Friends of Hebrew University. Our mission is to provide motivation and education for the discovery of mishpacha. We encourage not only looking back on family history, but also moving forward to connect future generations. There's many reasons why genealogy has grown to be such a widespread area of interest for hobbyists and serious people alike. Understanding the movements of migration is essential in making these discoveries. Professor Lederhendler serves as a Stephen S. Wise Professor of American Jewish History and Institutions at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is a modern historian who teaches on the American and European Jewish experience. He has authored numerous books, publications, and articles, many of which are scholarly treatises in use globally at universities. Professor, we appreciate your participation in the first webinar of the Jewish Genealogy Society of Greater Washington. It's yours to take away.
Thank you so much, Sheila. Thank you, Amy. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here with you and with all of the people tuning in. I'm just going to put up a presentation for you to look at, and we hope it will work. And we'll try that again. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to be speaking about migration, Jewish international migration, and in particular, I'm going to be talking about the mass migration from Eastern Europe that occurred between the early 1880s and the early 1920s, roughly in that time frame. The history and the study of Jewish migration does vary between the personal and the collective experience, and hence the title of my talk. The personal because in the end, it's up to individuals and families who make a decision at some point whether to stay, to leave, when to go, when not to go, who gets to go first out of a household, and so on. There are individual reasons for everybody, and they are personal and they're very different. On the other hand, when we're dealing with this period in Jewish migration, we're dealing with a mass experience, which means that all of those individuals who make their own personal decisions, they add up to something larger, perhaps, than the sum of the individual parts. Let me give you a quick look at what the state of the Jewish world was, roughly speaking, around 1880, in terms of where were some of the major concentrations of Jewish population. You'll notice right away that the United States and Canada already by that point had about 250,000 Jewish residents. Almost all of them had arrived in the previous century, many of them from areas in Central and Western Europe, but some from Eastern Europe as well. The major population reservoir, if you will, of the Jews at the time was in the Russian Empire. There were about 5 million Jews there around 1880 to 1890. Just a bit further to the west and south, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And if we add Romania as well, we'll get to a grand total of another 3 million Jews. And clearly the 5 million in Russia, the 3 million in Austria-Hungary, plus Romania, that gives us a perspective on where most of the Jews in the world were living at the time. And again, these created the main reservoir of potential migrants. In the Ottoman Empire, as well as in Central Asia and North Africa, there's an aggregate number of Jews living at the time of just under 1 million. In certain countries, you'll see I've put up the UK and Germany, just to give you another bit of perspective on what are the numbers that we're talking about. What happened to sort of make the sort of general headline out of all of this, what happened was there's this exodus of huge numbers of Jews, starting from Central Europe, but progressively coming increasingly out of Eastern Europe, as well as from other countries. And they're heading to places that really hadn't had many Jews at all until that point. And so what I'm calling this slide is the far peripheries of Old World Judaism were fated to become new centers of Jewish life. The New World was created on the peripheries of the Old World. As you'll see, North America, South Africa, Australia, Palestine is also a recipient during this period. And even if we want to go really far afield, the temporary, small, but rather interesting center of new Jewish immigrant life in China that existed between the end of the First World War and a few years after the Second World War. So there's a major expansion of the Jewish map.
Ellie, excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt. Could you please put your presentation into presentation mode? I think it would be easier for people to see.
Absolutely. How is that?
Thanks so much. Beautiful, thank you.
You're welcome, you're welcome. Okay, so what were the major receiving countries? In other words, Jews were leaving Europe, well, where were they going? Well, the United States accounts for the lion's share of all of the Jewish immigration out of Europe. About 75% of the total Jewish immigration overseas went to the United States, an aggregate number over 45 years of about 2.5 million. Great Britain receives about 250,000, Canada another 150,000, South America writ large, including Argentina as the major focal point, about 100,000. There are about 80,000 Jews who settle in Germany, 30,000 in France. Palestine gets about 85,000 in this period, and South Africa about 40,000. Again, the difference between a place like France, South Africa, or Palestine and the United States is very clear. Why would immigrants in this period prefer the United States so overwhelmingly as a destination country? Well, this has to do with the fact that all European immigration at the time and a great deal of East Asian immigration at the same time were all heading towards the United States, which was the world's most important developing economic power. What were some of the factors that influenced Jews on the ground in local communities in making a decision about where to go, when, and how to go about doing it? Well, first of all, there was a good deal of information that was being put out in languages accessible to Jews, such as here is an example of a pamphlet in Yiddish, one of a series of pamphlets, Der jüdische Immigrant, the Jewish immigrant. It was published in St. Petersburg in Russia. This particular brochure is from the year 1912, but there were other examples from earlier years. Who was in charge of spreading all of this information? Well, there were organizations that were cropping up in the Jewish world at the time. And the most prominent and the most well-known in Western Europe was the Baron de Hirsch Fund, which founded the Jewish Colonization Association, which was primarily responsible for Jewish immigration to Argentina, partly also to Canada. There was the French Jewish organization Alliance Israélite Universelle, which took a great role not only in handling East European, particularly Russian and Romanian Jews who were entering Austria or Germany and needed assistance. There was the German Jewish organization, the Hilfsverein der Deutschen Juden, otherwise known as Ezra. And on the American side, founded in New York, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which, as you may know, still exists today. So there were other organizations out there. And I gave you the example here, again, in that same column, of a Jewish Association for the Protection of Girls and Women, otherwise known in Hebrew as Chevrat Ezrat Nashim, founded in Buenos Aires. And this, as some of you may have heard, had to do with the fight against trafficking in women. Of which there was quite a bit going on at the time, and particularly in the Jewish sector in Buenos Aires. So that many organizations were proliferating. All of them had something to do with the welfare and assistance to Jewish immigrants. And that's a point that I'll address again in a few minutes when we want to know, why did so many Jews actually leave? There were hazards and obstacles that needed to be overcome or that stood in the path of these migrants. Obviously, there was distance and there was expense and there was the strangeness of going abroad and the fears that attended all of that. But also there were more objective things, like once you got to a place like Hamburg, where you wanted to take ship, there were quarantine procedures in place because there was a cholera outbreak of major proportions. And so one had to spend an indefinite number of days or weeks in these way stations, in these ports, not only in Hamburg, in Antwerp, in Bremen, and various other places. Now, one of the key questions that's always asked, particularly about the Jews who left Russia, and they were really the largest sector because, again, the Russian Empire had the largest number of Jews. It's often contended that the departure of Jews in large numbers for the West coincided, not coincidentally, with the outbreak of a series of pogroms, anti-Jewish mass attacks, that broke out in the spring of 1881 and continued to the following year, and in dribs and drabs carried on for another 2 or 3 years thereafter. And it's undoubtedly true that many Jews in the early summer of 1881 from those parts of Russia, what's known as the Pale of Settlement, that is, those provinces in the Russian Empire in which it was legal for Jews to live. And that was a huge territory, but not compared to the hugeness of the Russian Empire. At any rate, there were many Jews who were fleeing or scared or had heard about pogroms and were getting out of the way or figured it was time to leave. But take a look at the map. On the map, you'll see one circle colored in kind of yellow with the blow up in this box of the map of the concentration of pogroms in those early years of the early 1880s. As you'll see, the pogrom area was mostly in the central, south, and east of what is today Ukraine. Partly extending northward into what is today Belarus. Now, take a look at the other circle, the one that's outlined in red, which is to the north and west of the area of most of the pogrom outbreaks. Now, the reason why I've circled that one in red is because that happens to be the area where most of the Jews were living. And it also happens to be the area from which most of the Jewish immigrants were departing. As you can see, there's a bit of an overlap between the two areas, but it's not really that much of an overlap. And it's not to say that there weren't ever any pogroms in the Northwest, but it is to suggest that there were probably other individually determined reasons why people might pick up and leave, not only in 1881, 82, but in years afterward. And most of those reasons have to do with the fact that many people in the Jewish population, as in the non-Jewish population, were looking for a better life elsewhere abroad. The Russian Empire was not a congenial place to live by any stretch of the imagination, but it was mainly poverty and the political pressure of an oppressive regime that was creating push factors that were helping people to decide that it was time to go, or that a better future for their children would probably best be sought elsewhere. And this question of whether or not Jews were fleeing the pogroms as refugees or were rather voluntary migrants looking for a better economic future for themselves and for their children, this is an issue that historians still argue over back and forth. One of the reasons why it's somewhat less important to make a decision yay or nay, whether it was the pogroms or the economy, is that in the public perception at that time, particularly in the West, and I give you here a typical cartoon from the American press of the day. You see Teddy Roosevelt addressing Tsar Nicholas of the Russian Empire, telling him he ought to do something about the oppression of the Jewish people. And the public impression, not only in Jewish society, but in non-Jewish society, was that in fact Jews were fleeing persecution. And this has its own effect. It has its own effect in creating the idea, the myth, if you will, or the narrative that Jews are not simple economic migrants, but they are in fact escaping an untenable situation. I'll return to that a bit later in light of some of the questions that some of you have sent in. Who were the people who were migrating? Not everybody left. It's not a cross-section. About a third of the Jewish population did leave eventually. That means 2/3 remained. So who were the ones who left? First of all, they were leaving mainly from towns and cities. They were the main staging areas for immigration, not necessarily from the tiny little hamlets or städtlach in the outback, but rather some of them may indeed have moved to a town or city at some point, and then later on, we're going to pick up and leave from the city. Age-wise, we're talking about a young population, which is very typical of most migration streams. 70% were under the age of 45, and that includes a lot of children. 40 to 45% among the Jewish immigrants were women, which is far in excess of the proportion of women in most typical migration streams of that time and even of later times. I'll skip one or two of these points, although I'm sure they're probably fascinating to you, but I want to make sure we get the really important stuff. The northern and western areas of the Pale of Settlement in Poland predominated over the south, the Ukraine, as the major source for Russian Jewish immigration, as I noted with the map a minute ago. And finally, Jews also emigrated in very large numbers from the Austrian Empire, in particular, the provinces known as Galicia. Galicia today is divided between southern Poland and western Ukraine. Once before the end of the 18th century, those areas had been part of the Polish kingdom, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Many Jews lived there under the Austrian government. The Austrian government was enlightened. It had granted full political emancipation to Jews and other religious minorities. Jews didn't suffer from pogroms in Galicia. They did, however, suffer from the same poor economic and social conditions that was common to many inhabitants across Eastern Europe. And so the fact that Jews were emigrating not only from Russia, where there had been pogroms, but also from Austria and Galicia, where there were no pogroms. Once again, it goes towards the argument that many Jewish immigrants were being motivated by social and economic priorities. Now, I want to zero in on one or 2 points before we start looking at the American side of all of this story. What was the implication of the gender balance, the relatively balanced gender ratio in the Jewish migration as compared to other immigrants of the day and indeed of later? Normally, we see mainly men emigrating, and that is because they are the ones who at the time were considered to be the major breadwinners. They were the ones who were going to go abroad to seek a better source of income. They were going to send that money back home. They themselves were going to go back home in droves. About 30% of the non-Jewish immigrants who came to the United States in that era returned back to their home countries afterwards, sometimes less than 30%, sometimes more than 30%, depending on which country of origin we're dealing with. But when you look at Poland, Greece, Italy, the area of Austria-Hungary that was Slovakia, that is Slovakia today, those are areas where there was a huge rate of return migration of non-Jewish migrants. And again, you see a lot of men who are in that two-way traffic. Jews apparently were a bit different. They went with more women and more children. They were what has been referred to in the literature as a family migration, which brings us to surmise that, well, maybe Jews were not just economic and social migrants. Maybe there was an added factor. In addition to the social and economic pressures, there was the element of pogrom violence. There was the element of political discrimination in the Russian Empire. These may have edged the Jewish migration stream closer to what we would consider more of a broad cross-section of the Jewish population. So we should bear all of that in mind. Now let's look at the American side. Once these immigrants got to where they were going, what was the effect or the impact of having so many women and indeed families? Well, first of all, it was going to have an impact on levels of employment and home employment. More people, if you have a couple and 1 or 2 or 3 or more children, some of whom are already in their early adolescence, there's more income to be had through employment. 2, we're talking about the 1880s, 90s, early 1900s. Women who were married were in fact the ones who bore the main responsibility for keeping a house, shopping, cooking. And we know from records of the time that the presence of a woman in a household vastly improved the health conditions, the consistency of medical care when someone was sick, the sanitary and hygienic conditions of the home, the quality of food consumed. These were all things that were working in favor of immigrants not only succeeding and thriving, but also deciding to remain permanently. And in the Jewish case, unlike most of the non-Jewish cases that I mentioned earlier, Poles, Italians, Greeks, and so forth, only 7% of the Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe ever went back. Now that's not zero, it's 7%. You have to bear that in mind. And yet it's so much lower than in the instance of other migrating groups out of Southern and Eastern Europe at that time that it makes one have to sit up and notice that something was different in the Jewish case. And it wasn't only that who would want to go back to Russia? I grant you that. But there's also something to be said for the importance of so many women being involved in the Jewish migration stream. On the other hand, as scholarship has shown us recently, there are competing narratives about this question of women and their role in the success or the difficulties faced by immigrants in the United States. One is what I'll call the narrative of displacement. The narrative of displacement, and you'll see in the picture on the left, a scene from a film that some of you may in fact have seen at some point, the movie Hester Street, directed by Joan McLean Silver. It was adapted from a novella by Abe Kahn called Jekyll, A Tale of the New York Ghetto. It was one of his earlier literary creations in English. Very briefly, it's the story of a young Jewish man who immigrates to the United States and tries to establish himself there for several years, and in fact does quite well, and becomes increasingly Americanized. Several years down the road, he responds to his wife, Gittel, who has been demanding that he bring her over with their child, Yosele, to join him in New York on the Lower East Side. And as you'll see in the picture, and as you probably have guessed, there is already a cultural or social gap between the husband and wife. He is all decked out as a Yankee, and she is coming across with her Orthodox head covering, her wig, her sheitel, and thereby hangs the tale. The story, not to dwell too much on it, the story comes to a divorce between the husband and wife. And one of the upshots is that Gittel takes herself in hand and transforms herself into a powerhouse of energy to take charge of her own adaptation to her new life. So this is the narrative of displacement and empowerment. On the one hand, she's displaced from the culture in which she felt at home. These husbands and wives who were separated for quite a while, sometimes months, sometimes even years, developed a displacement within the household between him and her, and between generations. But there's also empowerment involved, and depending on how one wants to read the facts and the impressions that people left in memoirs and so forth. I give you here a quotation from another scholar who's looked at these questions from a social, ethnographic or anthropological point of view, comparing Jewish and Italian women. Katja Friedman Kasaba, who wrote Immigrant Wives and Mothers, found themselves living a paradox. On the one hand, migration to the United States promised the fulfillment of old world dreams in a new land and at least a degree of emancipation from old world hierarchies. And yet, as she points out, that wasn't always the case. Children figured prominently in this migration stream as well. Children and youth, we're talking about the flooding of Jewish immigrant children into public schools. Wherever Jews settled, they tended to plump for public schooling rather than private schooling. Catholic immigrants who were close to their parish quite often made the choice for Catholic schooling. The Jews didn't, by and large, except for a very, very small percentage. And that meant that it was going to be sort of a mass process of acculturation to the English language among the youngest generation. And this was going to have ripple effects upward in terms of the age structure. Children and young people played out in the streets, but they had clubs as well and organized activities, including summer camps that were organized by Jewish philanthropies to get children out of the tenement districts in the summer. There were also preventive programs aimed at preventing juvenile delinquency, which was a problem throughout the tenement districts in Jewish neighborhoods as well as non-Jewish neighborhoods. There was the question of trafficking in women that I mentioned earlier. It wasn't just in Buenos Aires. it was pretty much everywhere where large numbers of poor Jews emigrated. And so there were vocational training programs for young women as well as for young men. There were orphanages that were set up by Jewish philanthropies to help out families in distress. You didn't have to be an orphan, properly speaking, to be housed at an orphanage. It was a boarding school that operated on behalf of sometimes single-parent families, and sometimes families that had two living parents, but simply were not able to stretch the household budget to cope with the youngest children. One or two final remarks about how all of this appeared to those in charge of Jewish organizations and those who gave some thought to the way in which hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Jews were being packed closely together in these not very salubrious areas of the cities. At one point, Israel Zangwill, the English Jewish writer, and Jacob Schiff, one of the kingpins of Wall Street, very important Jewish philanthropist of the day, got together and set up a scheme that was called the Industrial Removal Office. It sounds awful, it sounds something like recycling, but indeed the idea was to take the industrial population, that is working class people, and to resettle them elsewhere in the United States throughout the length and breadth of the country. And the idea was to match up individual immigrants or immigrant households with existing Jewish communities across the United States. And one of the ways in which they tried to encourage this sort of wider dispersal of the Jewish immigrant population was by setting up a new immigration route directly from Germany or from Belgium, as you see in this poster here, from Hamburg and from Antwerp to Galveston, Texas, which became what was known as the Ellis Island of the West. And the idea was not only that, these people were going to bypass the major East Coast ports, but they were also going to be shipped directly to the central and western and southern parts of the United States and so forth. Many Jews in the Los Angeles area can trace their families' movements that way, and not only in LA, but in various parts of the United States. Here you have one example of a woman who, her name was Sarah Bernstein. You see her inspection card from the port of Bremen. You see the card that was sent by the Office of the Jewish Immigrants Information Bureau at Galveston to the headquarters in New York saying, "Dear sirs, this will inform you that Sarah Bernstein arrived safely." In other words, there was follow-up, there were case files. Those of you interested in genealogical research, there are plenty of archives, not only at the Center for Jewish History in New York, which has the highest archives, but also many of these organizations that I've mentioned here, such as the Industrial Removal Office and the Jewish Immigrants Information Bureau. I'm going to end with a personal note because, as I say, these stories tend to really straddle the personal and the collective. When we're dealing with 2.5 million Jews who came over and they were 1/3 of the Jews of Eastern Europe, then it becomes a collective experience. But within the collective experience, there are many individual variables. And I'll give you the example of my own maternal grandfather, who left Poland in 1920 and ended up in New York for a number of years. Later in life, he moved here to Israel. But the point that I want to make is that he started his journey as an illegal migrant using the services of human traffickers. From Poland, he was unable to get out legally because the Polish military authorities were looking to draft him. He had already served 3 years in the Russian army before 1914, and then the war broke out in August 1914. He went to war with the Russian army, was promptly captured by the German army, and spent 4 years as a prisoner of war under the Germans. This is in World War I. So altogether, he'd already spent 7 years in uniform, what with his normal service and his POW years during the war. And he wasn't about to be drafted yet again, so he left with a younger cousin, but they couldn't leave legally. So the whole stretch from Poland to Belgium was done illegally with the help of smugglers, bribes, and so forth. Once in Belgium, they did in fact obtain legal papers for a passage to Canada. And once in Canada, they were able to then, not without a problem or two, they were able to acquire papers to enter the United States, and they proceeded to New York. All of this in 1920, just before the immigration quotas were enacted by Congress, which vastly reduced the volume of Jewish immigration coming out of Eastern Europe. And the various views that you see here are of my maternal grandfather, Moshe, as a young man, as a prisoner of war in Germany, the train station in Berlin, where he arrived secretly in a locked train compartment, the boat that he traveled on to Montreal, the Grampian, and finally a cute picture of my mother at the age of about 3 years in New York, sitting on my grandfather's knee. So I will end my main remarks with that. What I will do now is to address some of the questions that have been forwarded to me earlier, and hopefully I will address with some of your particular questions things that others are wondering about in the group. I'll do that for the next 5 or 8 minutes or so. Then Sheila, I'll hand it on to you. Okay, so there were several questions that asked typically about what were the other destinations that Jews traveled to. One question was raised about the UK. One question was raised about South Africa. So let me talk for a moment about Britain. I had mentioned earlier that Britain, in fact, did absorb about 250,000 new Jewish immigrants from the 1880s to about World War I. 250,000 is quite a lot, because considering that there were less than 100,000 Jews there to begin with. So the Jewish community in Great Britain grew a great deal because of this East European influx. However, some of the Jews who landed temporarily in England didn't necessarily stay there. There's a lot of transmigration going on, bringing Jews out of the UK who proceeded afterwards to points like Australia, South Africa, and Canada. And so we know a good deal about this from people's memoirs and from archives. For the person who asked about South Africa, I certainly recommend to you to get in touch with the Kaplan Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Cape Town, which has a great archive, and they've published numerous books based on immigrant memoirs. Many of the early immigrant Jews in South Africa actually originated in Lithuania and transmigrated through Britain. Some of you asked questions about the motivations for immigration, and I've talked a bit about that there's a mix of we'll call them political motivations, that is, the kind of pogrom violence or other discrimination or oppression that goes on in the Russian Empire in that day, mixed with economic and social issues that were quite as important for Jews as they were for their non-Jewish neighbors. And I would simply caution those of you who in your family lore have been told, well, you know, we left because of religious persecution. One must use a little bit fine tuning when talking about what does that mean, religious persecution. Jews in Europe were not persecuted in the sense of their religion. They were free to practice their religion. Judaism was thriving in Central and Eastern Europe in those days. There was no restriction on the practice of Judaism. So it's not religious persecution per se that was driving anybody out. What can be called religious persecution in American terms, I suppose, would be discrimination on the basis of one's religious affiliation. That is, Jews were subject, in the Russian Empire at least, and in Romania, to various special taxes and discriminatory acts and regulations. And this, of course, became part of the general economic pressure that led to a good deal of Jewish poverty. So that I would say that that is where the sort of the negative push factors come into play. They're not necessarily religious persecution in the proper sense of the term. Moreover, as I mentioned about Galicia, and some of you brought up Galicia in your personal questions, Tarnopol, Lemberg, Krakow, Drohobych, those are the areas in Galicia with lots and lots of Jews, many of whom emigrated. Again, we're talking about a third, more or less, of the existing Jewish population that left. Once again, Austria was really quite liberal as far as political regimes go. The Jews loved their emperor. Franz Josef was a household god, more or less, with his picture hanging up on the wall. People mourned the demise of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of World War I because it had more or less kept the peace and more or less kept the Jews safe. But people leaving Galicia were leaving mainly for socioeconomic reasons. Some of them were also leaving because they didn't want to be recruited for military service, but that, of course, would apply to many non-Jews as well. Someone asked an interesting question about the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919. Of course, one has to think back, given our conditions today with the coronavirus. Was there any effect on Jewish immigration? And the answer is not that I know of. What we're talking about 1918, 1919, 1920, those were the years in which, after the First World War, lots and lots of people who had been prevented from emigrating during the war were sort of a backlog of waiting people, especially women, trying to rejoin their husbands, fathers, brothers, but also lots of men as well. Who, like my grandfather, for example, were otherwise detained during the war. So there's this huge volume of new immigration across the Atlantic in 1918 to 1920. Of course, that becomes part of the reason for the American Congress deciding in the end to begin restricting immigration from Europe, and they did so by means of the Quota Act of 1921, which was then made even more stringent in 1925. Someone asked about shipping fares for children. Were they reduced under the age of 10? I don't know exactly if that was the case. It would depend a lot on when these people were traveling. In the earlier decades of this mass migration period, most of the immigrants were traveling in steerage, which meant in the cargo hold of the ships that were outfitted with bunks like barracks. I don't think there would have been much differentiation between the price being charged. But if we're talking about later years, after 1910, 1920, people were traveling in second or third class cabins, and there may very well have been some sort of a ticket price differential. Someone asked about a family being moved or expelled from Moscow around 1890, 1891. And the fact is, Moscow was not inside the Pale of Settlement. That is, those parts of Russia in which it was permissible for Jews to live. Lots of Jews did live in Moscow. Nevertheless, most of them illegally, and they were in fact expelled in 1891, and most of them moved back into the Pale of Settlement, or may have indeed continued on to emigrate out of the country. Finally, two last questions, and then I'll wind it up. One person wrote in about descendants of conversos, Jews from Spain and Portugal in the 15th and 16th century who had converted to Catholicism by force or not, as the case may be. And then some of their descendants in the following years moved to countries that became Spanish colonies, countries that eventually became Mexico, Brazil, and so forth. I'm afraid I was not able to go that far back in the space of this one little lecture. I dealt only with, as you saw, the period of time from the 1880s. The descendants of conversos who continued to live in Latin America secretly as closet Jews or not. This is a fascinating story. It has been documented by a number of historians. In fact, a doctoral thesis was written 2 years ago in my department on this very topic. But again, it's not something that fits into the time frame of today's talk. One last question was asked about Jewish DNA and how did immigration affect the lives of people and their children once they arrived in their new country. Well, there is no such thing as Jewish DNA. Probably that should be said from the get-go. What we are dealing with in the research is that there are statistical patterns to be noticed in different populations in the world of certain genetic markers. After all, over 95% of human DNA is identical across the world. So there's no such thing as a Jewish DNA, but there are, statistically speaking, patterns, as I say, for example, blood types that vary in distinct patterns from different origin populations. Many Jewish origin populations have patterns in some genetic markers, such as blood type and a few other things that are typical for people who originated in the Middle East thousands of years ago. Of course, a lot has happened since then. So, we don't always count on the reliability of those genetic markers, but they are statistically interesting. One person who did try to make a study of the impact of immigration, not on DNA, which was unknown at the time, but physical appearance. The Columbia University German-born Jewish anthropologist Franz Boas did an important study in New York City on the parents and the children, parents who immigrated from Europe and their children. And in particular, he found, wait for it, big surprise, the children raised on American food in an American environment grew taller than their immigrant parents. That's an important finding. It has something to do with environment. As we know, genetics is not the whole story. It's mostly how our life conditions affect the genetic markers that we're born with and what gets to be expressed in our body and what does not get expressed. Some of you have asked specific questions about your families, their origins and so forth, and I'm going to recommend very warmly that you start to forward such questions to Sheila Wexler, who's sitting here and will be looking at your emails. She's, of course, here from the Jewish Genealogy Society of Greater Washington, with whom not only do I have the pleasure of sharing this panel, but who, in fact, inspired this entire session, as I understand it. So with that, I'll hand it on to you, Sheila, and it's been a pleasure.
Good. I got unmuted. That's unusual for me to be muted a lot. I know whereas a lot of our JGSGW members on here today, and they know I'm not easily muted. So let me, the first thing I'm going to do is address two of the questions that came from non-members, because my members know where they can find me. If you want to send me something, it's president@jgsgw.org. And I'll be able to see that whether or not you're a member and respond there. One of the questions was about family coming from a small town in Poland, and they'd been there for about 100 years. And I gather from the question that this individual has not started doing genealogy. And, let me just speak broadly because it does affect a couple of the other questions that were specific. When you work on genealogy, you start with what you know. And that means starting with yourself. I always ask people, do you have a copy of your own birth certificate? They look at me like I'm crazy. How about your marriage certificate? How about your parents? How about death certificates for them? Your grandparents. And you start working your way back. I discovered early on that getting my grandfather's Social Security application and benefits form, he put down his mother's maiden name, which was my great grandmother who never came here. No one in the family knew that name. And for years, that was kind of my hoarded little secret that I would exchange with members of the family in order to get photos and other pieces of information. But you start with what you know. And a lot of those records are here in the United States. I was able to, using, again, just the names of my daughter-in-law's other set of grandparents. Her father was, his family was from Poland, track down the city in Poland where they were from. And I had no family research on them. I just took the bits and pieces that I knew and was able to work on that here using the archives, using a Library of Congress, using ship's records, using Ancestry. Now, for me, because I'm serious about this, I will spend the money and pay for memberships in these groups and use their records. I get my money's worth out of their records. So I know how to track this stuff down, and I know what's there. What I've not paid for yet is paying for using the the global ancestry. And I've been able to find out so much using Jewish Gen, which has a lot of records for Lithuania and Poland and Russia that they've obtained, and it's free with Jewish Gen. This brings me to another point to mention again, and I'm covering your questions by mentioning these things, it's a favorite term that I use is border de jure. When you say they were from Russia, or they were from Poland, or they were from Romania, or they were from Galicia, and Galicia was not a country per se in the beginning of the 20th century. It was a region. My father said, oh, my family was from Galicia. And I always thought it was a country. And then he told me, no, it was Austria. We were from Vienna. No, you weren't from Vienna. What I find was the border changed often. And that's why I call it border de jure. And if you are able to figure out exactly what the location was, that'll help you. But that's why when you look at the census records, 1910 census, 1920 census, all those are available, it will say something like Russ Pol, RUSS-POL. That's where they were from. Or Yid Pol. It's whatever the census taker wrote down. Those things seem weird to find them, but they can help you pinpoint exactly where. So start at the present and work backwards, getting to wherever you're trying to go. And I would guess you'd be able to find that small town in Poland. I've got, ancestors who say, we're from Minsk. And from my own experience now, what I probably believe is they were from a small town near Minsk. And I think of my own experience when I traveled, somebody says, where are you from? I don't say, I'm in Morocco. I don't tell them Alexandria, Virginia. They don't have a clue where Virginia is, much less Alexandria. I say, I'm from the Washington, D.C. area. Oh, Washington, we know Washington. So I would suspect that a lot of our ancestors did the same thing. I'm from Minsk. I'm from Dvinsk. And I'm from Warsaw. And, and be prepared to look for different spellings of how the names are spelled. So I think in telling you these little things, I've covered a lot of the questions you had. One of the questions was, how did everybody wind up in the UK in the family? When people were ready to leave, and this is anecdotal, plus there's some historical scholarly work on this, when they were ready to leave their location, they took whatever money they had, they decided who was the most trustworthy person to go. Sometimes it wasn't dad. Sometimes it was the oldest son. Mainly they didn't want him to get drafted, and they would just take him as far as that money would. And in many cases, the money would take them to England. And they got to the UK and stayed. They figured, I'll get a job, I'll make more money, I'll get the rest of the family here, and then we'll go on to the United States. And it never happened. So that answers a lot of questions of why they wound up where they are. People got on the ship and thought they were going to New York and wound up in Philadelphia, which had a big port then, or wound up in Galveston. They didn't know. I can't imagine somebody from the Pale walking in and saying, I want to go to Galveston. they had probably not a clue where Texas was, much less Galveston. So they bought a ticket on whatever ship was there and got out of Dodge, so to speak. So I think that hopefully answered the question. The other thing is somebody might have mentioned, and maybe I saw it in the questions that came up about Landsmannschaften. And they said, how did everybody from Ukraine wind up there? Well, one person wound up there, perhaps by accident, and then wrote everybody, said, great place here, love it, no discrimination, great jobs. Food isn't so good, you know, it's can't kosher, but hey, we'll make some things. And families started coming. And once there was enough people there, you know, maybe even form a minion, next thing we know, we have a Landsmannschaften and we have a community. And I found that in Philadelphia. I never suspected, my grandfather's family was there. I always thought the Blausteins were in New York. I spent many an hour searching in Bayonne, New Jersey, when you had to walk in and look at the microfilm without finding him, and I couldn't understand it. Walking down the street in Philadelphia one day, I knew that his brother had lived there. I walked into the archives there and found the records I've been searching for 15 years. So now it's all online, but that's how these things would happen, and they would then move on. Let me see if there's any other question I haven't covered. I know some of you other people who have asked me the questions because you're our members, and if you didn't get your answer, just email me again. And many times we have some mavens within our group. We used to have our mavens would sit at tables at meetings and answer these types of questions. And I'm certainly not qualified to be a maven on these specifics, but you know, do send them to me. And I did see one other question that was asking about Cuba, and the professor didn't cover that specifically, but let me just address Cuba for a minute, if I may. I was in Cuba 2 Januaries ago. I think that was right. I was one of the last cruise ships that was allowed there. And in Havana, I took the Jewish tour. And, you know, the old joke, there's one synagogue you go to and one you wouldn't be caught dead in. Well, were 3 in Havana. And one was Orthodox, one was conservative, and the other was for the Sephardim. And they still have those populations, and they explained to us how they got there, the different migration waves that brought them there, and why they remained. And I see that Janina Duker just put up something about Cuba. Janina is going to be our speaker in January, talking about the Jewish calendar, how to read the Hebrew. But you know, there are some records available from Cuba. There's some burial records on Jewish Gen, which you can find there. And there's some people who have made some concerted effort to bring some information back. I'm hoping in this coming year, the administration, U.S. administration policy is reversed, and we're once again allowed to go to Cuba. We were bringing in aid. There was a rabbi here in Washington doing that and organizing some trips there. And there's a lot of information to be had. You just have to know how to work the system in order to get it out of there and to know the right people. So I think I've answered what I can right now without taking up more time. You know, if you would like to, Amy, take it back and do any type of wrap, and then I can do closing remarks, or I can go ahead and do that. You tell me what you would like.
Sure, you can go ahead and close.
Okay, thank you, Amy. We do thank everybody for joining us today. It's been a great pleasure to work with Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the American Friends Group and Professor Lederhendler. For nearly 100 years, Hebrew University has fulfilled its mission of training the next generation of public, scientific, and educational and professional leaders. And they preserve and explore Jewish cultural, spiritual, and intellectual traditions, and they've expanded the boundaries of knowledge for the benefit of all humanity. To learn more about the university or JGSGW, there will be a following slide that will give you some information, and we hope you'll be intrigued to continue or to start exploring your family history. There are over 400 Jewish genealogy societies globally, and there's probably one in your city or one in a nearby city. And because of everything is virtual now, our members at JGSGW are coming from all over the place because all of our meetings are virtual. So thank you for coming today and joining our community of supporters.